I'm Jennifer Freeman, and I'm the Associate Professor and Program Director for Theology and Arts at United, and I've been here, I'm now starting my 6th year. I think first off, I'd want to say that that precise word, anti-racism, is important. I think sometimes there's a tendency to, and I'll say explicitly, for white people to shy away from a framing of anti-racism because it sounds negative, which it is. I mean, it's a negation or a countering of something. And instead, I think sometimes folks prefer to use language of like racial justice or, maybe like like countering white normativity or something like that. And those are all fine constructions. But in my opinion, it's really essential that we use the language of anti-racism because there's no perfect terms, but I think it accurately gets at some of this work of countering and dismantling those systems of oppression, particularly around race. I think, so one, I just want to say I think we need to keep that term in our conversations. And if it is making people, and white people in particular, uncomfortable, then of course that's a thing to pay attention to. Why, right? And then the second piece of that I'd say is that for me personally, it feels like a call or a charge to be actively engaged in that work. That the term anti-racism to me is one that encapsulates movement. I'm a visual person, so I'm going to start feeling like there's actually a posture somehow that comes to mind with the term anti-racism, and I think it involves the shoulder. So there's something like kind of pushing against and like having momentum. Dismantling white normativity and white comfort, because together those two things have perpetuated and ensured oppression and violence. And so what I would hope for is really a radical reorientation of where comfort lies. It's such a huge shift. It's kind of hard to imagine because all of our history has been, framed by and built on white comfort and white normativity. And so the question is really exciting, but also difficult because it makes me, the very phrasing of the question makes me aware of all of the construction that has happened, all of those scaffolding and so on that's happened. So we would need a radical, reorientation almost. And we've talked about, you and I and our faculty, does this whole enterprise actually even work because of that foundation? The American project is built to run this way. It's running the way it was designed to run. And what do we do with that? What do we do with that as religious leaders? And we're called to envision something more, but it's difficult when the very institutions we've been trained in as religious leaders and all these things are part of that system, even as they're, kind of fighting against it. But on a hopeful note, I would want to see a United where there's this clarity and transparency and a real, this is where I find your language really useful in the kind of athletic conditioning, because it's so much a process and it's so much an embodied learning and relearning. And so I would like to be able to be hopeful to imagine a United where those reflexes that happen have been radically retrained, that we can, when a comment is made in the classroom or some reference, something pops up, that our innate embodied reflexes have been kind of reprogrammed to respond to those things differently. or to be able to talk about them differently, you know, all those kinds of things. And I think it's possible, but it's very deep work. I mean, from a societal, you know, kind of perspective, of course, I hope for things like the restructuring of systems, reparations, land back, and I think that United is the place where we attract those students who are interested in that work, and I think that we can equip them to do it together. And I think what we have, you know, kind of what is uniquely possible at United is that we are engaged and interested in the political and the cultural and the historical and all of those things, but it is also our spiritual and religious and theological training and context and work that undergirds all of that and motivates it. And I think that anti-racist work needs to be holistic, you know, needs to be about the whole person. It's a pastoral care issue, you know, as your work talks about too. So I think that's what's kind of exciting, and I can see a path. Well, I hope and I strive to embody anti-racist work, and all the levels are kind of all components of my teaching. But it's always very much a work in progress. And so, I mean, that goes from, you know, the syllabus to the classroom, basically. And in the syllabus, so at United, I primarily teach classes in historical theology and art history. I'm usually teaching pre-modern content. So for me and my syllabus, it's important to, what a diverse syllabus means to me, I can put it that way, is of course having authors of color, having gender diversity in my authorship, and so on, religious diversity, but also in the content that I'm, you know, presenting or teaching on or lecturing on, and so on. And I think because it's easy, or there's a maybe assumption or association between Christianity, like Christianity is a white colonizer's religion. I mean, that is true. It's not true. It's been instrumentalized, you know, of course. But in my classroom, one of my main goals, it's a not at all secret agenda, it's an explicit agenda, is to complicate that for our students and to introduce them, for many students, introduce them actually to the diversity of Christian expressions historically, and especially in the pre-modern world, and how actually, you know, in the pre-modern world there was a lot of intercultural exchange through trade and travel and pilgrimage and all these different kinds of things. So it was often much more diverse than people realize, and complicated, because that means that there was racial thinking happening in the pre-modern world. There was oppression happening, not the same as what we experience in 21st century America, right? Like that's a different context. But there were also moments of collaboration or constructive, you know, kind of things, or interreligious dialogue. And so my hope is that by introducing students to the complexity of that, which of course we can also find in the 21st century, and so there's always also a conversation between the pre-modern and the modern, we can nuance their understandings of Christianity. My own specialty is in pre-modern Christianity. And in fact, in the historical theology class, I just explicitly say, if you have one takeaway from this class, it should be that when you think of the history of Christianity, you should think of Africa, like, full stop. One of the ongoing growing edge aspects of this work for me in relationship to teaching is in what we kind of refer to as like classroom management. Which is just maybe like, can think of as like moderating conversation, moderating dialogue, all of those kind of interpersonal things in the classroom. And I guess as a historian, that work is not something that I'm trained in necessarily. It wasn't the skill set that was emphasized in my education, to put it mildly, as opposed to maybe the experience of some of my chaplaincy and pastoral colleagues who, have a better skill set in that way. So I think that's always been a growing edge for me, regardless of teaching context, but especially here at the seminary where our work is personal, it's vocational, the stakes are high, folks are here with trauma, religious trauma, various kinds that they're bringing in, and so it raises the temperature in the classroom pretty quickly, even as we are all, I think, invested in having a healthy dialogue and good classroom community, all those kinds of things. We come together, I think, with shared goals, but it doesn't mean that things can't get tense. And I think there's a degree of that that's really healthy, but it's all, again, in how we manage and respond to it. And so when it comes to anti-racist pedagogies, I think that I'm aware of my own desire for that white comfort thing that I said earlier. That's at play with me as the professor in a position of power, and I try to keep my kind of sensors up for, okay, what's my motivation here? Why am I responding to this or not responding? What am I letting slide or not? And trying to be aware of teaching moments that I can, use most effectively, hopefully without alienating or harming anyone in the classroom. And that's a lot to manage while also, say, talking about 4th century Christological controversies or something like that. So it's all, it's important. Yeah, I think that the United faculty has a lot to offer the work of anti-racism. The phrase is sometimes used at United, uniquely united. And I think the faculty is uniquely united. I think some of the things we bring to that conversation is, first of all, just our energy as a faculty and the way that we are inspired by each other and just enjoy working alongside of each other, having these conversations. And these are interdisciplinary conversations, and I think that's really key, the way that we can learn from each other. What does anti-racist work look like in your discipline, in your classroom, in your experience? And that immediately, we're a small but mighty faculty, and I think that immediately enriches the conversation. And I think that we are all committed to this idea that seminary communities, theological education is needed in this current moment, and that we have unique things to offer our student body, but also the world because of that holistic approach. It is a spiritual problem. That's not to distance anything. It's not to say that it's not serious in the here and now, or to kind of say, oh, it'll be resolved at a later time. It keeps that sense of urgency because there's physical harm and spiritual harm, social harm, all these things that are happening. And so we need the united faculty to respond to it from our vantage points.